Okay, good morning. Can you hear me well? So we are starting the second day of LASI 2021, LASI Spain, here in Barcelona with a hybrid audience. So about 22 people following online and around 20 here in the room in the Universitetet Pompeu Fabra campus. We are starting the second day with a keynote. The keynote speaker is Professor Barbara Wasson. So, and on behalf of SNOLA, the Spanish Network on Learning Analytics, and the LASI Spain Scientific and Organization Committee, it's our pleasure to welcome you and to introduce Barbara as keynote speaker for this edition of LASI. Barbara is director of the Center for the Science of Learning and Technology SLATE at the Norwegian National Center for Learning Analytics. She was one of the founders of Kaleidoscope, a network of excellence in Europe around learning technologies, a network that many of us remember well because of the impact and the activities that it has. And Barbara has been also coordinating and participating in a number of projects, of research projects in the area of learning analytics and other, let's say, educational technology areas such as computer-supported collaborative learning, mobile learning, learning games, artificial intelligence in education. Today, she will be speaking about learning analytics impact based on the experience that has been accumulated across several research projects. I think it's a highly interesting topic for all of us, researchers in learning analytics and connected areas, a topic in which all of us are reflecting in relation to the challenges and obstacles for making an impact on education, a topic that is very much of the interest also of the Spanish Network of Learning Analytics. So we are looking forward to this keynote speech. Thank you, Barbara, for accepting, for joining us today. And now the screen is yours. Yeah.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real honor to speak to everybody. I was saying to Camilla, one of my PhD students who's here watching today too, I've just got to get somehow I've got the picture, wait just 1 minute. I've got the picture of people in the middle of my screen and I can't seem to move it. Just wait 1 sec. Let me stop again, see if I can get that over there. Okay, let's see now. Okay, you see my screen okay? Yes, I can see it even. Oh, it's how wonderful for all of you to be able to actually meet. And I was so hoping things would calm down and I could actually come to Barcelona, but it'll have to be another time. And I want to thank Davinia for inviting me to talk to you. I think you were the first LASI in Europe. We started our LASI Nordic in 2017. And we have been trying to meet face-to-face now for over 1.5 years, but we're still putting it off till next June. We're going to have a one-day online session in November and then, in August, and then we'll meet next June in Stockholm. Okay, so I'm going to talk about learning analytics impact. And I was thinking afterwards, maybe I should have called it implementing learning analytics, but they're very related anyway. And I want to talk more as some of my thoughts around this than telling you how to do things or anything like that. And it would be very nice if we could have some discussion at the end of this. First of all, I want to say I wish you all welcome to Bergen someday. Here we are down on the west coast of Norway, and everybody knows us as a very wet city, but we've been very dry this year. It's actually more rain in Oslo. And today it's actually some sun just came out. And here's some other pictures from Bergen. So I really want to entice you to come and visit us. And this one I took last Friday night at about midnight. Down on the UNESCO heritage site called Bergen, which you see on the bottom left picture on your screen as well. Okay, so if we go back and we look at the most used definition from the first conference on learning analytics and knowledge, we all know this one, but learning analytics as the measurement, collection, analysis, reporting of data about learners and their contexts, for the purposes of understanding and optimizing learning and the environments in which it takes place. And if we reflect a little bit over this, we've got learners, context, learning environments. What is it we're actually really trying to understand? Because learning can be many things. It can be looked at from a psychological perspective, from a pedagogical perspective, etc. So we could be talking about learner behavior. And in fact, there's something, Zach, I forget his last name, at Harvard, he looked at all the papers up until about 2014, and he talked that learning analytics really was a field of learner-centered analytics, not learning-centric, because we really were just counting what learners were doing. And that was probably true in the early days. But we're trying to move beyond that and looking at maybe learning outcomes. Can we have impact on learning outcomes? Can we understand learning processes better? Can we understand, maybe that can help both pedagogically, it can help maybe from a psychological perspective to understand what learning is if we're going into different kinds of multimodal data maybe. We also look for things like self-regulation, about motivation, about engagement. So I think it's important that we really try to think about what it is we're really looking at in our different studies. And all of these are relevant to be looking at. When we look from a teaching perspective, we've got teacher or instructor behavior. I think this is an area where there hasn't been maybe so much looked at. We've got things about learning design. I'll show you one of our examples here that we've been working on. Curriculum design, professional development. So for example, for the instructors or teachers. But we also talk about educational practice or educational spaces. So if you look at it, we've got a huge, huge pot of work that we're doing and many different perspectives and ways. So I think it's really important that we fence in what it is and when we're describing what it is we're really trying to work on. And when we're looking at impact, it can be in many, many different ways as well. Because for me, I think impact can be impact on research. And that's what most of us work at. We're trying to give some impact in our research field. And a lot of us strive also to try to make some impact on practice. Now, impact on practice and seeing it out in, whether it's for different stakeholders, and I'll come to that in a moment, has been a challenge in the field of technology enhanced learning. As you remember, we had and as Davinia mentioned, we have the large Kaleidoscope network with over 400 or 500 researchers involved in that. And one of the problems that arose after in funding education to technology work in the EU, as you know, our field has disappeared as a research area that they fund directly, is because they don't show impact. So where does all the results of all our research, where do we show it? And where can they see it transferred to practice? And this has been a challenge for many of us in the field, and I think it still is. So I think as researchers, we can just plug along, we can do our research, we can ask questions, design studies, we get approval for access to data. And this is important because it's easier, in fact, to get access for research data than it is to really do learning analytics out in practice. And I'll show you some examples of that. And our results are really impacting publishing. We get new insights into learning, into teaching, into environments, new insights into learners and teachers and how they behave. But do we actually see these results being used in practice? And I think that it's really difficult to see that. If you think about what technology is being used out in schools, then we see things coming from commercial companies. Do we really see a lot of things that are being transferred from our research to practice? And I feel frustrated about this after many, many years in this field. Does anyone listen to us? But who is it, this anyone, that we would like to have listened to us? So who are the stakeholders when it comes to learning analytics? Well, we've got learners and teachers. We do dashboards for them, or we try to give them adaptive learning, get them know what's going on in their classrooms with their students, etc. We could have student tutors or study leaders. School leaders are often listed, but how are our learning analytics helping school leaders? Policymakers, ed tech developers even. There's some nice work within the field of AI in education, the work of Educate, Rose Lukin and her colleagues at UCL in London that have worked with many, many ed tech companies trying to bring them up to speed on using artificial intelligence in education. Maybe we need the same for learning analytics. And in fact, My center was funded, we got the funding in 2015, although we didn't start up to 2016. We get the money directly from the ministry. And the first person who called me was a small ed tech company and said, okay, how do I add learning analytics to my tools? And I was not prepared for that, I have to say, at that time. But it was interesting that they right away wanted to have some knowledge about how to do this. And of course, researchers are stakeholders for our work. And I would say the majority of our impact is on other researchers right at the moment. And maybe we're starting to see a little bit from policymakers as well, into policy, excuse me. Okay, so I'm going to reflect a little bit on this impact into policy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about policies, both at national and in institutional policies for learning analytics, both in with some examples from Norway and Finland, and I know there's other impact in other countries, but at least I'll talk about these two that I know a little bit about. So the momentum in Norway is that in the last years, we've been having work done at the Directorate for Higher Education and Research, working on a new digitalization strategy in Norway. And they have managed to put into, they have managed to include the goals that learning analytics is a part of teaching and learning. Learning analytics monitors teaching and learning analytics facilitates better research on teaching and learning. And this has become part of the digital strategy for higher education. However, you have to go from strategy to action. So they have in their action plan for the first 2 years of implementing this new digital strategy. And I was sitting on one of the task forces that was looking at the overall architecture. So this digitalization strategy has for all the IT infrastructure, research infrastructure, and everything in Norway. And I was sitting in one of the small committees, and I got to give some input on some of the things they were writing about learning analytics. But there really was a drive also from within the directorate. But they have managed to give some input to the committee that's working with the new higher education law in Norway. And this was inspired, in fact, by JISC's work in England, where we have two alternatives that they really would like to get into the law. Either that learning analytics is a duty, it's an obligatory task of institutions related to the quality work of what they're doing to provide good education for students, or they want it as a defined alternative when it's not there, it's not obligatory, but there is still a legal basis for doing learning analytics in higher education. And I'll come back to this aspects of legal basis later. Whether this gets in this year, probably not, because there's a lot more work that needs to be done on learning analytics, but at least it's on the table, it's talked about. The other thing is that we have these stortingsmelding, they're called. They're the official white papers from the government. And this one is on about having students complete education. So getting them through the school system. This one is for the lower education. And here on page 92, we see reference to Camilla's and my report on, we had a state of the field report from 2017 on learning analytics. So we've made it into the white papers in the government. And one of the effects of this is that the government is putting together a task force that's going to investigate the pedagogical, legal, technological, and ethical issues using learning analytics and ownership of student data in schools. And this is really important because, again, it always will boil down to the legal aspects. And I'm sorry to keep saying I'll come back to that, but I will mention this in a bit. But here we can see that even though we didn't have any idea that this was happening, they actually bring in some of the research that we actually are doing, and they look and they see how this pushes them forward and having to deal with this issue of learning analytics and what it is, and especially about student data. Okay, if we look in Finland, they have the Ministry of Education and Culture, and they have a section called analytics. So most of the ministries around the world will have an analytics department. They do all the statistics for education, etc. Some of them may be doing learning analytics. I don't think in Norway they're doing that yet, but maybe eventually we'll see that in the future. But they have representatives from various stakeholders in the field of education and research, and they're getting them to document the best practices in the implementation and utilization of learning analytics in order to try to develop a framework for the implementation of learning analytics in Finland. So in some ways, they're doing a tiny bit the same thing that we're doing in Norway, but they're taking another approach because they're bringing in the different stakeholders. And I don't know whether there's researchers. I hope there's researchers involved in these aspects as well. They have made a project called DigiVision 2030, and it's a joint project between all the Finnish higher education institutions, being led by Aalto University, and they've put in a lot of money. They've put in 17.8 million into the project for the first 2 or 3 years, and then in addition to that, they're putting in 20 million euros. It's a lot of money into this particular project. And the vision here is to restructure Finland's higher education over the next decade by the means of digitalization. And key areas for development include digital pedagogy and guidance based on the learner's path and shared data. So here it's really about making the education more flexible. If you want to see an interesting vision, you should go and look at this. They have an online site because they're really looking to make higher education seamless between, you could say, continuing education and education while you're working and while you're a student at the university, and make it very easy. But the thing that's interesting also here is one of their 4 promises is that they're going to have insight into what data they have about learners for all data. So they're having something called My Data, where all learners can get to see what it is they're doing, and they're setting the learner at the center of the development of everything, and that the data is going to be used for individuals and for society. So here we see also something that where they don't say learning analytics per se in this project, even though they do in the previous project, but they're definitely talking about understanding learners' paths and etc. And then they also in Finland are having a number of processes within individual universities. For example, at Turku University, they've discovered that it's not possible to reuse a policy from another university. So if you have a policy on learning analytics, and I can't remember if they were looking at one that Helsinki or Aalto has been using, but they found out they couldn't just reuse it at their university. They have to tailor it to the individual university. So we think we're alike, but we're really not alike when we start looking at an institutional level for sharing data and how you organize the infrastructures at your universities, et cetera. They're so different that the policies have to be developed for a local situation. And at Aalto, they identified 23 different roles within the university that are involved in if they're going to implement learning analytics on an institutional level. And this, again, we've seen all the figures of who's involved in learning analytics, et cetera. And there really are a lot of people that have to be involved. So this is not something you can just go to somebody at the university and say, okay, let's do learning analytics, because it really is going to involve a lot of different people across many different aspects of the university. So there really needs to be a strategy for how to deal with this. And if you look at the Sheila project, they dealt with this on learning analytics on an institutional level. So they've got lots of interesting suggestions there and methods for doing this if you're interested in working at institutional level. So when we come back to this, though, when we're looking at these national and institutional policies related to learning analytics, do they really know what learning analytics is? And I would say they don't. Like, it's quite interesting when you interview people that I mean, this word has gotten this, it's a trend word, and it's got so much, I've never, in all the 35 years I've been involved in this field, I've never seen such enthusiasm at the top level of governments or anything that people are actually, like in Norway, we set up My Center, and they're trying to put into the law about using student data, et cetera. There's a real momentum going on now, but do they really know what learning analytics is and how challenging it is to do something that actually tells us something that's useful? So I think they know there's many opportunities. So they've got all the promises and the visions, but they don't really understand the limitations and challenges. And do we, until we actually really try to implement something instead of just using a nice data set from a tool or from our class or something? There are lots of limitations and challenges. So the pressure is on everybody. We have to do a good job. We have to try to show how our research can be relevant, and we have to try to get it out there. And I don't have any good solutions for how we're going to do that, but I think because there is so much focus, and the focus is very high up, both at institutional leadership, at directorates for education, at government level, there's a real pressure and an opportunity here for us as well to make an impact on this field. Okay, so now if we go to practice or implementing learning analytics out in practice, I'm going to use two examples, one from higher education that Camilla and I have been working on, and then another in the school sector, the project we've had for 3 years in Norway. So in higher education, in the beginning of the corona, the university put out a call for funding, that they would give funding for projects related to COVID and the impact at the university. So we, in 1.5 days, put together a really nice project application. It was unbelievable how quick we got this together, and we got quite a good amount of money to carry out research on understanding the digital transformation at the university and understanding the responses to COVID-19 at the university. And we divided this into 4 themes. One theme on organization, leadership, and innovation. So what has happened top down at the university. Adaptation to online teaching and learning. So those are our surveys of students and teachers at the university. And then Camilla and I worked on learning design and online courses because we wanted to see, was there a change in the way that Canvas was being used, for instance? And then looking at digital student behavior, where we're looking more at the activity data from the different systems. So today I'm going to talk about this level of the work on the learning design in the online courses. So we had 2 questions: how are courses structured in Canvas? And we decided to look at the fall of 2019 and then 2020, because that gave us this spring of 2020 where the real changes came. So we could see how the system was being used in 2019, and did we see changes in how Canvas was being used in the fall of 2020. So I'm going to look at that. We also were interested in how the courses were structured in different disciplines. And I'm not going to speak on that. I'm just going to give some examples of what we looked at. So we identified all the bachelor programs at the university using the online descriptions of the course of the programs. And we've looked at and decided to pick courses from the 3rd semester. So of the 6 semesters that you have at a university, we picked 3rd in the middle. And we looked at courses. Our courses all had either 10 to 15 ECTSs, and they had to have been offered in both the fall of 2019 and 2020. And I am a super user of Canvas at the university, so we are able to access all the courses on Canvas, so we can see everything that's there. And that I'll come back to in a moment, because this was a real struggle for us, actually. Okay, so when we looked at this, we ended up with 106 courses across the university, which means that there's 212 Canvas designs, one from 2019, one from 2020. They're distributed across our faculties, where the humanities faculty actually had the most courses, 52. The science and math and science faculty had 21, social science 17, the med faculty 7, psychology 5, and the faculty of arts, design, and music had 4. Now, we think the reason, for example, for med having less courses, because they're educating doctors and their course structure is not having small courses. They educate in a completely different way, and the same with the arts. Psychology also has very many programs in clinical psychology where they also don't maybe use the traditional type of courses that we use. But anyway, this was the distribution we ended up with. We went into each course and we looked at the features in each courses. So if you look down, if anyone has Canvas, you'll recognize that you have a number of features that you can choose. You can use announcements, assignments, discussions, grades, people, pages, outcomes, rubrics, quizzes, etc. There's many different features. And we used the student view to see what the students were seeing, to see if that particular feature was used. And then we went into the discussions, and this is where being super user allowed us to actually go into the discussions and see if the discussion was actually used, because sometimes it was indicated just in the list that it was in use, but you had to see if there was any kind of threads, you had to open it up. So Camilla did a great job going through all these courses and looking at these features. So we grouped the features into administrative, content, and activities areas. So administrations were things like announcement, people, and grades. Content included files, syllabus, pages, videos, and modules. And activities were things like discussions, quizzes, and assignments. And we were interested in, do we see any changes in the way these features are being used between the two falls? So here's the fall of 2019. We see, and when we think of these three features that could be used, announcement, people, and grades, we see the majority of them are using two of these. And I think grades is the one not being used the most, because we have another system called Inspera, which we use for grading. But that's what I thought. But already in the fall of 2020, we see that 89 of the courses are using actually all of the grades. Remember, there's 106 courses altogether. So we see a shift already when it comes to using these sort of administrative aspects to moving towards that. So we can say, yes, there has been a shift there. When we look at, and Canvas is not obligatory, I forgot to say that in the beginning, but we saw that. So we were expecting to see that as we moved completely online, there might be more use of it, actually. When it comes to using the content, the files, the syllabus, the pages, modules, etc., then we also see a little bit of a shift from I can't see the numbers on here, but usually they were using around 2.9 features, and now they were using at the mean 3.8 features. So we can see also a shift here in using those, sharing the content on the system. However, when it comes to using the more activity-oriented aspects, the discussions, the quizzes, assignments, we see less shift. There's a little bit of a shift, but not as much as in the others. So we can say they haven't been really that good. And I'll have an observation on that in a moment. So if we look over all the 11 features that are actually used, we moved from a mean of 5.7 in 2019 to 7.82 in 2020. So yes, we have definitely seen a shift, and it has been more in sharing content in administrative aspects than engaging students in activities. So there is this trend of using more features. And as I said, it's the administrative and content features, no significant increase in the features that enable student interactions, collaboration, or assessment. Thus, the use of Canvas is more supplemental and complementary, as according to Whitmore and colleagues. I think that this is really because, as we all know, when people are just reacting, they're reacting to the fact that suddenly we had to overnight, we closed down on the 12th of March, and by Monday, which was a Thursday evening, and by Monday we had to have all teaching online. So suddenly people were running to use Canvas in ways they hadn't been before. So it's really reacting to it. And there is a lot of differences in the disciplines. So there was real struggles in those fields that have much clinical work, of course, which really Canvas doesn't help them very much with. So this is one thing, and I don't think that we can really say that there has been really good use of Canvas for, this kind of activities that we want to engage students in. But we do see that it's actually being used more administratively and with content. And this is really good input to what we have, the Learning Lab at the university and the University Pedagogy Unit, because they're the ones that train people in using the ICT tools. So they can really realize that no, even though we have moved, yes, more to Canvas, when we look at it in more detail, we see that not really in a good way. Of course, we do need to share the information, etc. And it is maybe the first step to get some people who've never been online, but we really need to get people more to use the activity features. The other problem, so now when it comes to the challenges of doing this and implementing, and if we were going to do this in a real way, the problem is that Canvas is only one of the many tools being used. They're using Zoom and Teams and Discord, live streaming, or sorry, that should be live streaming from the classrooms. So my colleague, who is the leader of the university pedagogy, he said he'd been trying for 10 years to get them to give them a live streaming tools in the classrooms at the university. And in 10 years, he had not managed to do that. But over a weekend, they managed to order all the equipment, and they have 139 classrooms or more at the university now that have live streaming. So you're getting these more hybrid type courses because we suddenly were allowed to have maybe a third of the classes back, or a third of the people in the class, and others were finding live streaming. So we could go into later on in the pandemic, we could go into more hybrid learning. And the only way in looking at the activity data that we're trying to look at as well, that we can see that they're using these other tools is if they link to Zoom from a module, then it will show up in the activity data that's created by Canvas. But we also have been working with the IT department, looking at some of use of these other tools, but it's not broken down to the course level. So we don't know how you can relate that. So this is one of the problems with learning analytics, is sometimes we actually don't have the data that we need to say anything really useful because the data is sort of disjunct or it's not complete, etc. The other challenge we had here is that everything was hand coded and then analyzed with simple statistics. But we're currently trying to read the learning designs from the Canvas activity data and from the way that Canvas is described in a FS database. But it's a problem of access to this. Can we get access to this data? So another PhD student of mine, she has access to Canvas activity data, and it took us almost a year to get access to that particular data. We have to have consent to the students. But even to be able to allow to have consent, the data is owned by somebody, and the department that owned it, one person there was a bit skeptical to this. So we had to involve the data protection officer at the university and everything to get us this. And it literally we were almost ready to change her PhD research because we were not getting access to the data. Once we were allowed to have access to the data, however, all students each semester, when they register for the semester, they're asked if we can have access to their data for research, and between 78 and 81% say yes. It varies back and forth. So we do have access to the activity data. We also have open Canvas at University of Bergen, so we don't have very many analytics aspects. The only thing that of analytics that's generated from Canvas when you don't have the full Canvas package is the number of pages that people have looked at and what days they looked at them. You don't get very much information. The interesting thing about this is the head of IT told me, well, I guess he told me something in confidential, I can't say it, but this has ended up where data is being stored in Norwegian data is being stored with Canvas is an issue, but we don't have that issue because we have all the data at UIB. And the other challenge is that data comes from other sources. So how can we put all this stuff together to really say anything good and to really, really understand the learning designs? And one of the things that this particular theme showed us is that the learning activity data that we have from a learning management system, is it really that interesting when you see that the learning designs vary so much between the different courses? So how can you say anything about the activity levels of students when there actually is no activity for them to be involved in? Maybe they aren't even sharing resources in the learning design. So for me, you're going to have to look at both the learning design and with the activity data together. And how we do that is one of the challenges we're looking at right now. So it depends very much on the learning design. When it comes to permission to use the data, as I've told you, we have permission to use the student data, but Camilla and I went several rounds about, do we have permission to use the instructor's data? That's what we're actually looking at. We're looking at the data that the individual course instructor has, how they have designed their course. And we didn't have the possibility to ask everybody because we don't know who teaches what courses. That's actually one thing we don't know without going into the course and seeing who's teaching it, because it's not written on the web pages or anything like that. So it was not possible for us to figure all of that out. The fact is, we found out that the default for our Canvas is that all courses are actually visible. So all the courses that we have looked at, the 106 of them, are open to absolutely anybody who has access to our Canvas installation, but they can't see whether there has actually been a discussion going on or not. That's where we used my super user. So me as a super user can actually go in and see that. We were not interested in anything about the content of it or anything like that. We didn't look at that. We just looked to see if there actually was one thread, and then we could say that it was being used. So this I really felt bad about. I'm going in and looking at my colleagues' designs, and I don't think that they know their course is open for anybody to look at. And I've talked to other university friends at other universities, and their courses are not open like that. So the default in our installation of Canvas is that your course is open. So we went through a discussion with our data protection officer at the university and have it really detailed, written down exactly what we were doing as to whether we had to go and get permission from these users to use this data or not. And she in the end said, no, we didn't need to ask them to look at this. But on a more morality aspect or ethics aspect, I'm not 100% so sure about this. So this is one of the challenges we need to work at. And this is a good example of the kind of challenges you come up with when you're really trying to work with data that's other than a little research data set that you have. Okay, now I will go over and talk to you about a project that we have in some schools in Norway. And this project is called, I'll come to that in a moment. But this again brings up this issue of, can we actually use the data? And this has to do, as we all know, about the privacy regulations around the use of personal data and sensitive data. We have the GDPR, which I don't have to explain here. And the GDPR is really dependent upon consent and obligatory to do things. And that's very tied to your national laws. So I'll go in a little bit more detail. So sorry, I wanted this 1, 2, 3, there. Okay, so for instance, when you're working with higher education, consent is a little bit easier to use because people over 16 in Norway can give consent. So if you have consent, then you can actually get data. When it comes to education in schools, then it's a little bit different because a child cannot give consent. It has to be the parents that give consent. And then that makes this a very much, bigger and higher issue to deal with. So what you try to do then is look for the obligation of the institution, being the school in this case, to give good education to the students, which then can be used to say that, yes, I need this data. But it's not just the data that's the issue here. It's also the algorithms that use these data. And in learning analytics, of course, we use algorithms, and we're using statistics, and we're using machine learning, and we're using different things. So we can't just think about the data. And it's actually, first it's the access to the data, and then it's what the algorithms are doing with the data that becomes an issue. And the GDPR has this issue of privacy by design built into the program. And that means that we have to think of privacy from the beginning when we're developing our tools or our algorithms, etc. And we also are required to do a data protection impact analysis or assessment on the tools that we're developing. And when we're doing this as researchers, we don't really have to do this. But as soon as we're coming to making a tool that's going to be used out in the schools, then yes, we have to deal with this kind of issue. So I'll come back to these challenges after I describe this project to you. So the activity data for assessment and adaptation project, ABT, it's a project that's owned by the municipality of the Association for the Municipalities in Norway, the municipality of Oslo's Department of Education, and then we're the research partner in this particular project. And I'm sorry, I'm getting stressed because they've decided to work on my roof right now and they were not scheduled to do this. So do you hear all that banging? I'm really sorry. I don't know. Oh, okay, I'll just continue. So what we're interested here is monitoring student progress and recommending tasks. So the motivation behind this is that, do you hear the banging? Someone shake your head or something, tell me. Yes, I'm sorry.
It's fine, Barbara. I think we can hear you and we can follow you despite the background noise.
Okay, I will try to talk loud and quickly here. We're almost done. So in schools, students use a number of different tools in a subject. So for example, in mathematics, one of the areas we've been working the most in, students have an opportunity to use many different proprietary tools coming from many different vendors. And for the teacher to find out how the student's doing in each of these, they have to go into each of the tools. And then it gets complicated for them. They don't have time to do that, etc. So the idea in this particular project, and this idea comes from the education department in the municipality of Oslo, is that we're going to take all the activity data from these and we're going to store them ourselves. And then we're going to provide, we're getting this, we've asked for this in an international standard, the XAPI standard. And then we have a central Fagkart, Mitt Fagkart is the name of the tool. And then it's going to have dashboards for students or for teachers, for parents, for many different stakeholders. Actually, it has to have. By law in Norway, all parents have to know what data we have about their students. About their children. So we have to show some view on that as well. So that we're determining exactly how we're going to show that and what data can we actually show back to the vendors themselves. But in this case, I'm going to show you the teacher work. So early in the project, 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, we had interviews with 12 different teachers that use these kinds of tools, and we wanted to know what do they want to know about their students. Well, one thing we determined a number of things. They want to know at the individual student level, at maybe a group level or at a class level. They want to know what discipline topics they're working on, what competence goals they're working on, what exercises they've been doing, what are they having trouble with, what things about the exercises, are they having trouble with multiple choice? Are they having trouble with drawing? What competence gaps can we determine? And what should they do next? And whether the privacy and ethics are in place for these particular tools. So that's sort of the background. So the work we've done based on this has been trying to give them some of the insight into some of these things they want to know. So we've developed this dashboard called Mitt Fagkart, where the teachers log in through we have a national authorization system, which makes it really nice. So for anything in schools, teachers and students log in through this. We have it for the universities as well. So it takes care of all the security and who has access to what, etc. So our front end is this dashboard, and the back end has a learner model that we developed from the activity data at this point, and analysis and recommender algorithms. Now, the national curriculum in Norway is built upon competence goals. So it gives you at the end of the 5th grade, the students should be able to do this in mathematics. And they describe it in these particular kind of competences. And then in addition to that, they describe things like the key elements of learning that are there, one of the 5 key skills that you learn, which is reading, writing, mathematics, digital skills, etc. And then they have these verbs, things like action, they're actionable things like formulate or solve, explore or use, represent, argue, etc. So there's about 40 different verbs that you can find in these Larapan. The nice thing in Norway is that this is in a digital format called the GREP database, so we can use that. And the EdTech vendors, if you're going to be working in a school in Norway, you have to tag your items that you're delivering to students to these competence goals. So there's very nice things. So one example could be explore and explain the relationship between a fraction, decimal, and percent, and use these in mental arithmetic. So you've got these very quite complicated competence goals, and the teachers generally take these goals and break them down into some level that's usable, but they don't come at that usable level, and they're very complex, some of them, when they get that way. And this doesn't mean that, this means that we can't do very good analytics. We can do analytics, of course, on the competence level, but in order to use it and get down to actually what they're doing in mathematics, we need to make a domain model. So we have used, first of all, what we've done is taken the teaching plan for mathematics, in this case I'm showing you, and we've developed a domain model, which is called a Fagkart in Norwegian. And all of the items in this are found in this, but it's putting it together in a relational relationship. So this is the one for mathematics. There's 5 main areas of mathematics in Norway: algebra, geometry, numbers, and understanding of number systems, functions, and statistics and probability. So these, and the light, those are the dark blue, and then the light blue are the areas of lower levels within this. So it's a little bit of a hierarchical chart, and relationship between the different disciplines in mathematics as well. And some of these actually are linked as well into other subject areas, but I won't show that now. So what we need to do then is the EdTech vendors, which are used to tagging their tools to the competence goals, now have to tag their items down to this Fagkart. So we've built a tool that allows them to do this. And it's broken down even to the level that they can pick verbs. So the different colors now. So the yellow are verbs here. So in this case, it's the verbs make and explain. So an item that they have, they might have to make something, or in another one, they might have to explain something. And we want to know the difference between this, because this is really important to the teachers. And they want to know that it's if they're doing it in practical situations, or are they doing it from a textbook, etc. So we've made it so that all the items from an individual vendor can be tagged. Then we can publish this tag. It becomes a URL, and that URL is then embedded into the XAPI statement that they send to us. And then the other aspect is that they also can get a copy of the JSON code of the entire tag that they can use themselves for their own tools, etc. The problem has been to get people to have time to do this tagging. So we have, and the tagging, the quality of the tagging is up and down, and getting the vendors to get the data into XAPI format hasn't been as easy as we hoped, but I'll come back to that in a moment. So once we have that, we have the data, then we can visualize this, and we remember that this is a cross tool, so it's not within one tool. We can do different kinds of visualizations, and my master's student Maria just had it in her master's exam, where she was looking at doing different kinds of visualization, and she's done a more user-centered HCI approach to developing these, and worked with the visualizations with teachers to find out which ones are best. So the knowledge areas can be represented as trees or circular trees, with the size and the colors having meaning for how much the students have been working on those topics. The verbs, which are really important to the teachers, because they want to know, are they having trouble argumenting? Are they having trouble comparing, etc.? She's used a word cloud, which they actually really quite liked. And then you can click on a word and you'd be able to get the data underneath it when we have the data there. And then the competence goals and progress towards that. And that's more difficult, because you have to decide how you're actually going to do the modeling of that. And what does it actually mean to making progress towards it? At this point in time, it's really just straight statistics on how many times they have been working on that particular tool, or that particular competence goal. But we're looking towards whether we can use different kinds of modeling. Bayesian modeling doesn't seem to be the right way to do it, but there's other methods that we can be using. So this project is not finished, and we're really just getting going now on the analytics. The other thing that's interesting is we can show very easily which of the tools have been used in which month and how much they've been used. So the teacher can really quickly see, okay, look, the students have been using the first tool, the dark blue one, more often than the other tools, etc. And in fact, the potential is there to actually eventually, when we have enough data, to do the machine learning and find out which particular tool tends to be helping the students more towards their goals if we bring in the grades of the students and answers to quizzes and how much that kind of stuff. So there's very much potential here in all of this. That's not the point though, what I want to tell you about. What has happened with this project is the impact has been enormous. And it's actually quite surprising to me, because now we are looking at an ecosystem for learning analytics in the school sector and how we can make this together. Now, this is a project that is looking at adaptivity and recommending in systems. And I've shown you those parts. The leverandeur logs in as well. We've got a planning tool made by the directorate, and we've got a search tool that can be used to find items that are relevant. So all these things together are going to work, but I don't have time to go into all the details around that, but another time I can tell you, or you can ask me. But the thing is that we were invited to a meeting to talk to the ministry and to the directorate for education about this. And we thought there would be like 5 or 6 people. There ended up being 50 people there. So this project has gotten a lot of attention because we're actually trying to do something in schools. And now I'm going to tell you the challenges with this. The other thing that's interesting is this last one I want to tell you about. We've got a new model for billing of use of tools. We're calling it, it's sort of, we refer to it as the Spotify model, where schools will pay by item use and not by a license for a whole tool that maybe is not used so much in the school. So this is a lot of controversy with the vendors in the sector, but it's a really interesting approach to trying to change how these particular tools are being used. Okay, so challenges with implementing it. Who owns the data? There's a legal basis for allowing data use, and it's anchored in your educational laws. In Norway, it's our educational law for schools and higher education law. And it has to do with this consent or obligation that I've mentioned before. And it also goes right down to the level as to whether your algorithms are recommending or they're automatic. So the results of your analytics, are they actually making a recommendation to somebody who then has to use that recommendation? Or is it making an automatic decision in the system? And when you're out there working in the schools or anything, these issues come up. You have to do this risk analysis. The risk analysis, in Norway, the experience is you have to bring in parents and students and teachers and school owners and everybody. And we're in the process of doing this, and I'll mention that in a moment. And you have to have a data handling agreement. So, and then it has to do with how the data can be stored, whether it's de-identified, pseudonymous, etc. How long can you have the data, etc. It's just a lot level higher than when you're doing research. Do you have the right data? And this, we're really at the mercy of the learning tool developers. Again, that's another whole course as to there has to be some kind of collaboration between we researchers who have the research questions that we know are important to answer and the people delivering the data to us. And one of the problems, as I say, we have had is getting the data into the XAPI format. We're working really hard with the vendors now. We had no idea we would have to work with them, but lots of them are very small companies and don't have a lot of people. So it's an issue. Do you have access to the data? So can we get the data real time, or is it scheduled? The vendors have to implement an API for us to be able to access the data. Again, this is not so easy for all of them. We have got it for a couple of them right now. We're working specifically today, this afternoon, with another one to get the API implemented, etc. So you have to deal with that kind of issue. The quality of the data. Do you have the data in the right format? Is it in the XAPI format? In our case, we need it tagged in the right way. And how do we deal with the missing data? And we know that's a challenge for all of us working in any kind of data systems, is how do you deal with the missing data and the quality of the data, validity, etc., all of these issues. And the data analysis, it's the same thing. A lot of the packages that you can use to do analysis don't work on certain formats of data, so you have to do that. And then the certainty, what are the legal repercussions? And this is what I really learned in learning that is, the decisions coming out of your analytics algorithms, if they have a result that is legally based, and for instance, giving a mark to somebody is anchored in the education and the higher education law, then you actually have you have to really be careful what you're doing, because there can be a legal repercussion based on the algorithms. And this brings us into the explainability. So everything that's about explainable AI, responsible AI is relevant also. And we see that movement now coming into the learning analytics field. So the explainability and how does that work? The nice thing about for us is that our National Data Protection Agency has started a sandbox for artificial intelligence. They're the first ones in Europe that are doing it. And we've managed to be picked out as one of 4 projects. The other ones are government agencies working in predictions in medicine, etc. And then they picked us because we're working with the school sector, and we're looking at the legal basis for handling student data, looking at the data, the risk analysis, about transparency, because I don't understand how explainable do we have to be, how low level do we have to explain, and how do we actually communicate that to our different stakeholders, in this case, children, parents, etc. So this is really exciting, and this work's going on all this fall. So I can tell you more next fall about it, but it just shocks me the amount of things that are really not about the what we think of as research or analytics that have to come into place if we're going to implement and have impact in schools. We have to go through this. Okay, so in summary, when we think about our data, we have to think about access, about ownership, about all the privacy and data protection rules around it. We have to think of the context in which we're collecting it. Do we actually have the right data? Is it explainable? And we have to remember, we just don't reduce ourselves to data. It's only part of the picture of everything that's happening. When it comes to implementing, we've got scalability issues. We've got interoperability issues between different data sets. In our particular case, we actually have interoperability on the same kind of data between different vendors. There's standards, and we have these problems of algorithmic transfer. So it's like policies for learning analytics can't be transferred from one. We can learn from them, but we can't necessarily transfer them. It's the same as we know with algorithms. They're very dependent on the context in which they're implemented, the data they have, etc. When it comes to impact, are our results usable? And I haven't talked a lot about that we hope that when we do the analytics that they're usable in a good way. And then even if they're usable, are they used? Do we go to all this effort? Are they used in the end? And can we eventually show good learning outcomes from our work? And of course, we have the ethics, the privacy, and the morality issues related to all of this. And I always end, anyone who's heard me talk, with Paul Kirschner's nice picture here that he used to explain that we have to really remember we can't reduce people to their data, and we can't reduce learning to just the data that we have. We only have the data that we can see and we can access, and sometimes the most interesting data is outside of our light where we can see. Okay.
Thank you very much.
I'm sorry I got so stressed with these.
No worries.
I couldn't even see a clock anywhere. So there. I hope we have time for a question.
Yes, we have some time. We have a coffee break just after the talk, so we have some flexibility.
Okay.
So let's now open the round of comment or questions. I think, let me see if there is any hand. So there was an applause, but not a raised hand by Elsa. Okay, any question in the here physically or remotely? I think we have one at least for the moment. So Janice is asking.
Yeah. Hi, Barbara. So it was a great talk. It's real research in the field with real problems. So I was just not to talk too much. We are extremely interested in the sandbox for AI in schools, as you know. This is something that we are going to explore in our next national project. And about the studies in schools, I mean, your approach reminded me of the Minerva project in US, where
Yes.
they have a single institution where they can set up the competence model and go down to the analysis techniques and the scripts and everything.
Yeah.
So they had, since it was totally centralized, then the process was, and the technology was theirs, the privacy. So we reduced all the problems to almost nothing. But
Yep.
I was amazed in your case that you were able to deal with all the variety across a nation and across different tools. So I don't know if you can simply.
Are you thinking of the eBloom project that fell apart after a year?
The what project?
The eBloom, the Bloom project that in the States that they tried to. There was a project there, and their problem was basically they didn't have the stakeholders with them. I mean, that is a particular issue.
In my case, when I talked about the Minerva project.
Minerva, yeah, okay.
The Minerva, but in what I wanted to ask you is how, if you can just tell us a couple of secrets that say why in Norway you could have this access to the tools and the tool providers and do all this stuff. Because I mean, over here, I mean, the power of the university of the researchers is almost null versus Zoom sense or whatever, or versus a mathematical tool, whatever.
Okay, I don't have any tricks as a researcher, but this project was instigated by the municipality of Oslo. They're the ones with the vision that wanted this. And in fact, they wanted it. The project started out, they do not want one vendor to have access into the schools. They want there to be a variety of tools. So they don't want one vendor to come in and have the power there. So they said that if you're going to have access to our schools in the municipality of Oslo, you have to share your activity. The activity data is owned by the school system. It's not owned by the vendors. And so this is our data, and you're going to have to share it with every other vendor. So the beginning of the project actually started out, we implemented a portal for exchange of data so that if a vendor had an item that was addressing this particular topic in mathematics, and they could access the data about that topic and a particular student from all the other vendor data. Now, the vendors were nowhere near ready to do this, and they weren't really interested in having anyone else, having data from anybody else. So we've gone away from that to having a more central model. And if you think about it, I would say our analytics at this point are not very sophisticated. They're really just putting together what you would find in a dashboard within an individual tool into one thing. But it becomes powerful because the teachers then can go to one spot and look at the data. And there is a belief, we actually had to dampen the expectations of what could be done from the people wanting to implement this. So we've had to calm them down and say a little bit more what's realistic to do. So the thing is, the project has almost become, as you mentioned, about making these things work together than about the interesting analytics we can do, which we hope to get to once we get the data into the right format. Now, to get the vendors involved, we find that the reason that we have lots of interviews with them as well. So, I mean, there's many aspects to this project. They're interested in not being left behind. If they see that the way that's going to happen is they're going to have to be able to share this kind of data, that they're going to have to pay in this particular way, they want to be within it from the beginning. And we underestimated the amount of work that we would have to do together with them. There is this feeling, and this is, I sit on the task force in the European Council for AI and Education right at the moment, and we all say the same thing. There's this impression that AI and education or AI systems are rampant in the school systems, and the same with learning analytics systems. They're not. We found one tool in Norway that I would really call a learning analytics tool, and it's built on top of the Newton engine from New York, and it's in one of the math tools as well, but they can't participate in this project because they don't have access to the data, which is an issue as well. What was I going to say? Yeah, so we found out the tools really are not that sophisticated, the ones that are using here. I think that in the Netherlands, there's more tools. What I understand from Inge Molnar is that they have more adaptive tools in use and in Netherlands and maybe in England, but in Norway, I think, in Germany, I don't know the situation in Spain, but I mean, this, if people are interested in this, we can make this maybe a topic in our Learning Analytics Community Europe, our new SIG, which I can promote here now. We could make an interest group that's interested in these kinds of issues, because it's quite fascinating. So I think we have found that when we want to work specifically directly with one vendor, just getting the data into the right format, etc., this is interesting. The other thing is that in the Standards Norway, who deals with technology standards, they have had a learning committee that has been looking at learning analytics. So lots of these vendors have been attending meetings since 2016, when the XAPI format was chosen as the format for data exchange in Norway. So that was already decided. And then the other thing in Norway, as I mentioned, we had this one login tool. It's called FADA. So it's an authorization, and all applications that are going into the school system have to be accessible through this FADA. So that's where the students, so that does a lot of the things like data protection and who has access to what, etc., is done for us. So there's a lot, and I think that's why this last slide I showed with this ecosystem is interesting, because we have a lot of tools that are already developed. And in Norway, there's this, I would say, we collaborate to compete, because already early on, our banking system, they collaborated very, very early to have a data exchange between banks in ways that they don't in other countries. So I think there's this kind of, a lot of things in place that make it help. So I would say it's not being promoted by us. We got in the fact that we should do this centrally. And now we are working on, making visualization, doing the dashboard type of stuff, making sure that it's usable and it's relevant for them, etc. And we have visions, lots of visions of what we could do if we could get good data. So we're just going to have to wait and see the quality of the data that we get over time. Sorry, that was a long answer.
That was great. So hope
Okay.
to keep up with all this discussion about the ecosystem. It's great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Then we have a question from the remote participants in the chat. By Kanan, she says that in the company she's employed at, they are moving to another learning management system that have better data tracking capabilities. They are aiming at making more use of XAPI statements. Her question is how the dashboards built in your project with the schools could transfer to other learning and workplace learning.
Yeah, I think that this is very interesting. I would be interested to know, Kanan, what the platforms you're transferring to are. The thing about dashboards, and this, if you want to read a really, really good thesis, you can read Iona Jevitt's recently, The Dashboards That Loved Me, her PhD thesis that came out, and some of the work they have done. The dashboards, like anything else, need to be tailored to the context in which you're working. In the type of thing we're doing, as I said, we are really trying to give the teachers the information that they want to know. For instance, they're really interested, do the students have problems when a task that they're giving is visual versus a word problem? And one thing we know in Norway is that mathematics, our PISA scores start going down as soon as they start getting into these word problems. So there's something there, that transitioning from, the math that you do that's very visual, and then you get into complicated word problems. So there's different skills that come in. So I think the ideas of having dashboards, yes, you can have dashboards for anything. That's a whole field in itself in learning analytics as to whether, the effectiveness of dashboards. Abelardo Pilardo would try to argue that we need to be giving feedback to people instead. But Iona, as I said, she has a really nice, thinking about what the dashboard's being used for. Is it just straight giving them insight into their behaviors, etc., or are we trying to go beyond that and give them some, hit the self-regulation aspects? Are we trying to give them cognitive help, etc.? So dashboards can be many things. So I suggest you look a little bit at that. And so I think our dashboard doesn't transfer to adult learning or workplace because it's tailored to schools, but I think the ideas of dashboards could be, and there's lots and lots of work in the field doing that. Yeah, so that I see what you've just, she's just written that building the framework from critically from the verbs and interactive objects would be the first step into imagining it then, yes. And I think the thing is that, as I mentioned, our curriculum and what the students are to learn are based on these competence goals that are described with verbs. And that, I think, so if you can analyze what it is, the kind of material that people are working with, then you can come to see if that kind of thing is in your curriculum at all. So it's just very, very based on the fact that we have these competence goals that teachers work with about, you know, students learning to argument, students learning to do things. And the interesting thing when we started this project is because we have these domain models for English and for Norwegian, and some of the things go across. So we have these, our new curriculum has across the disciplines goals or collaboration areas. So things like argumenting, you can do it both in math and you can do it in English. So I mean the analytics are absolutely endless, interesting things we can do if we can get the good data. So right now we're putting a lot of effort into trying to get good data. Yeah.
Okay, it was indeed an inspiring and highly interesting presentation that connects with many of the things that are being discussed in the LASI these days, and especially also the discussions among the members of the SNOLA network. We thank you very much, Barbara.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, for this presentation this morning.
Okay.
And yeah,
wish you a good
many of us will be in contact with you also through the SNOLA network, maybe, and in connection with the SIG, the European SIG that you mentioned.
So we will come back strong after the summer with the SIG, and
yes,
if Alejandra is here, we have to get our act together and get more, get our at least we can start some topics of common interests across Europe. It's very, I think there's many things that we can share together for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for me, and have a wonderful rest day. Thank you.
Okay, and probably next time in person, which is
yes, we hope so, for sure, and everybody to Bergen at some point too. Yeah. Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.